Forget everything you think you know about how this story survived. Most people imagine it like a ripple in still water, a quiet, gentle spread of a beautiful idea, passed from heart to heart, embraced by the hopeful and the humble. A story too beautiful to die. That image is wrong. Dangerously, completely wrong. The resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth was not received as beautiful. It was received as a threat. What would you do if someone you watched die, executed publicly, in humiliation, by the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen, was suddenly being declared alive? Not metaphorically alive, not alive in memory, literally alive. Body gone, tomb empty, witnesses multiplying. What would you do if that declaration was coming from the same city where the execution happened, just 50 days later, in broad daylight, in front of tens of thousands of pilgrims? And what would you do if stopping it meant silencing not one voice, but dozens, and then hundreds who claimed they had seen him? This is not a story about faith overcoming doubt. This is a story about a message that powerful people tried to bury, and why they couldn't. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, and how we understand what the early followers of Jesus were actually risking every time they opened their mouths. If this kind of deep historical storytelling strengthens your faith, consider subscribing, because every week we go back to the ancient world to understand the roots of what we believe. To understand why the resurrection claim was so dangerous, you have to understand Jerusalem in the spring of 30 CE. Not the Jerusalem of illustrated Bibles. The real one. Jerusalem during Passover was a city under visible military occupation. Roman soldiers were stationed at the Antonia Fortress, a massive stone structure built directly adjacent to the Temple Mount, with staircases descending into the outer courts, so that troops could respond to any disturbance within seconds. Pontius Pilate himself traveled from Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem specifically for the festival, not out of religious interest, but because Passover was the single most politically volatile week of the year. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims flooded the city. The population of Jerusalem, normally somewhere between 40 Saudi and 80 Saudi people, swelled to perhaps 3 or 4 times that number during the festival. People camped on rooftops, in courtyards, on hillsides outside the city walls. The air smelled of roasting lamb, burning cedar, unwashed bodies, and the iron-rich scent of sacrificial blood. The temple was processing thousands of animals. The noise was extraordinary. The bleating of sheep, the shouting of merchants in the outer courts, the chanting of Levitical priests, the constant metallic clang of commerce. Into this compressed, combustible environment, the Roman administration and the Jerusalem priestly aristocracy shared one overriding concern: order. Any messianic movement, any figure who attracted popular loyalty and challenged existing authority, was a fuse in a room full of oil. Jesus had been that fuse. His entry into Jerusalem the week before Passover, his disruption of the temple commerce, his public confrontations with the Pharisees and Sadducees, his growing following among the Galilean pilgrims, all of it had placed him squarely in the most dangerous category a first-century Jewish teacher could occupy: prophetic agitator with popular support. The crucifixion was not an accident. It was a calculated act of political suppression. Roman crucifixion was deliberately public and deliberately slow, precisely because it was designed as communication. The message was not just, "This man is dead." The message was, "This is what happens to anyone who disrupts the order we maintain." The body was displayed. The location, just outside the city walls, visible from the main roads, was chosen to maximize the audience. The charge posted above the cross, "King of the Jews," was not just an insult, it was a warning. By all historical logic, that should have ended it. Executed leaders of popular movements in first-century Judea did not typically inspire lasting movements. The Roman and priestly authorities had crushed messianic claimants before: Judas of Galilee, Theudas, the Egyptian prophet. And in each case, the movement dissolved when the leader was killed or disappeared. The pattern was reliable. Remove the head, and the body collapses. What happened instead was the opposite of collapse. Within days of the crucifixion, something disrupted the expected pattern so completely that the disruption itself became the central claim of a movement that would not stop growing. The tomb, sealed with a large stone and reportedly guarded by soldiers, was found empty. And the people who said they had encountered Jesus alive afterward were not speaking privately, in hushed rooms, among trusted friends. They were speaking publicly, in the temple courts, in the synagogues, in the streets, with a boldness that contemporary observers found either electrifying or infuriating, depending on where they stood. The question that first-century Jerusalem had to answer was not, "Is this theologically interesting?" The question was far more immediate. What do we do about this? Because the claim was not disappearing, and the people making it were not stopping. The men and women who first declared the resurrection were not operating in a vacuum of consequence. To understand what they were risking, you have to understand how social and legal power actually functioned in first-century Jerusalem. The city was governed by a layered system of authority: Roman imperial power at the top, exercised through the prefect and his military apparatus. Beneath that, the priestly aristocracy centered on the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and beneath that, the dense social fabric of synagogue communities, family networks, trade guilds, and neighborhood obligations that structured daily life for ordinary people. These layers were not separate. They were interlocking, and they were all, in different ways, hostile to the resurrection claim. Consider what it meant practically for a Jerusalem resident to align publicly with the followers of Jesus in the weeks after the crucifixion. The Sanhedrin had the authority to expel individuals from the synagogue. In a world where the synagogue was not merely a place of worship, but the center of communal legal arbitration, charity distribution, social identity, and business relationships, expulsion was not a spiritual inconvenience. It was economic and social devastation. You lost your community standing. Your children's marriage prospects narrowed. Your business partners distanced themselves. Your credibility in legal disputes evaporated. And that was the mild consequence. The temple authorities also had their own police force, the Temple Guard, distinct from the Roman soldiers, with authority to arrest individuals within the temple precincts and in surrounding areas. The Book of Acts describes this guard arresting Peter and John in the temple courts simply for publicly teaching about the resurrection. They were detained overnight, brought before the full Sanhedrin, the same council that had orchestrated the trial of Jesus weeks earlier, and warned explicitly to stop speaking in his name. Notice what the Sanhedrin did not do in that moment. They did not produce a body. They did not present witnesses who could testify to having seen Jesus alive after the crucifixion and later clarified it was a misunderstanding. They did not offer a counter-narrative explaining what had actually happened to the corpse. The response of the most powerful religious institution in Jerusalem to the resurrection claim was not refutation, it was suppression. That detail is historically significant. These were not credulous people. The Sadducees who dominated the Sanhedrin were, doctrinally, precisely the Jewish faction that rejected resurrection theology entirely. They had every ideological motivation to disprove the claim and every institutional resource to investigate it. They controlled the temple treasury, the priestly records, the network of informants in a city where they had operated for generations. If the body of Jesus was recoverable, findable, or explainable, they had both the motive and the means to find it. Instead, according to Matthew's Gospel, the response of the chief priests when the guards reported the empty tomb was not an investigation. It was a bribe. The soldiers were paid to say the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. It is a strange defense. A guard who sleeps on duty under Roman military law faces execution, and a guard who is sleeping cannot testify to what he did not see. The cover story was hastily constructed and internally incoherent, which tells us something important about the pressure under which it was invented. The disciples, meanwhile, were not hiding. This is perhaps the most historically striking element of the earliest days after the resurrection. The natural expectation, the psychologically and sociologically predictable response of a group whose leader has just been publicly executed by the state, is concealment, dispersal, silence, grief-driven retreat into private mourning, and the slow dissolution of a community that has lost its center. What the historical record shows is the opposite. 50 days after the crucifixion, during the festival of Shavuot, Pentecost, the followers of Jesus were not hiding in the upper room. They were in the public spaces of Jerusalem, in a city still packed with pilgrims from across the diaspora, declaring openly that the man Rome had crucified was alive. Peter, who weeks earlier had denied knowing Jesus 3 times to a servant girl outside the high priest's courtyard, was now standing in the shadow of the temple itself, speaking to thousands. Something had changed in these people. Not gradually, not through a slow process of grief resolving into renewed purpose. The change was sudden, total, and occurred at enormous personal risk in a city where the authorities who had killed their teacher were still fully in power and actively hostile. The historian must ask, what produces that kind of transformation? Fear does not explain it. If the disciples had fabricated the resurrection story to preserve the movement, the calculus of self-interest runs directly against public proclamation in Jerusalem itself. Weeks after the event, in front of people who had witnessed the crucifixion firsthand. A fabricated story survives best in distance and time, not in the immediate vicinity of the event, among eyewitnesses, under the watch of hostile authorities. Grief-induced hallucination does not explain it either. Not at the scale described, not among diverse individuals in different locations at different times, not among people like James, the brother of Jesus, who had not been a believer during Jesus' ministry and whose reported encounter with the risen Jesus transformed him into a leader of the Jerusalem community willing to die for that testimony decades later. Something had happened, and it had happened concretely enough that the people who claimed to have experienced it were willing to absorb flogging, imprisonment, expulsion, and, for some, execution rather than recant. The authorities understood, even if they could not explain it, that this was not a rumor that would die on its own. It had to be actively managed, and active management, as it turned out, had exactly the opposite effect from what they intended. There is a specific texture to how information moved in the ancient world that modern people consistently underestimate. We live in an environment where a story can be suppressed by removing it from platforms, flagging it as misinformation, or simply drowning it in competing noise. The ancient world had none of those mechanisms, but it had something the modern world often forgets to take seriously: the extraordinary density and reach of oral networks operating through physical gathering spaces. In the first century, the primary architecture of information was not the written scroll. Scrolls were expensive, slow to produce, and required literacy to access. Literacy that, in rural Galilee and among the urban poor of Jerusalem, was far from universal. Information moved through people, through markets, wells, synagogue gatherings, pilgrimage routes, trade caravans, and the deeply embedded social practice of hospitality that required travelers to be received, fed, and heard. A merchant traveling from Jerusalem to Alexandria carried news as surely as he carried goods. A pilgrim returning to Antioch or Babylon or Rome after Passover brought back not just the memory of temple worship, but the conversations he had overheard in the streets, the stories circulating in the courtyards, the strange reports from the Galileans about their executed teacher. The geography of Jewish diaspora in 30 CE was vast and dense. There were significant Jewish communities in Alexandria, Antioch, Damascus, Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, and dozens of cities across Asia Minor, North Africa, and the Italian peninsula. These communities maintained active contact with Jerusalem through pilgrimage, correspondence, and the continuous movement of teachers, merchants, and family members. The three great pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, functioned as annual information exchanges on a scale that no institution in the ancient world could easily monitor or control. The resurrection claim entered this network at Pentecost, precisely when Jerusalem was at maximum population density, precisely when the diaspora Jews who would carry the story back to their home cities were present and listening. Luke's account in Acts lists the geographic origins of the crowd present that day, with a specificity that reads less like theological symbolism and more like a travel manifest. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Cretans, and Arabs. These were not metaphorical locations. These were real cities with real synagogue communities where real people would return home weeks later with a story that their own community would then have to reckon with. The authorities in Jerusalem could arrest Peter in the temple courts. They could not arrest the Parthian pilgrim who had stood in that crowd and was now 3 weeks into his journey home. This is the structural reason why suppression failed, and why it was almost certainly going to fail from the beginning, regardless of how aggressively it was pursued. The information had already escaped the controlled environment before the controlling institutions fully understood what they were dealing with. But there is a second dimension to this story that is equally important and far less often examined: the role of persecution in accelerating, rather than halting, the spread of the message. Within a few years of the crucifixion, a systematic effort to suppress the Jerusalem community was launched under the leadership of a Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus. His own later account describes the campaign with brutal clarity. He went house to house, dragged men and women to prison, cast his vote for their execution, and pursued followers of Jesus beyond Jerusalem into surrounding regions. He was, by his own description, extraordinarily zealous and extraordinarily effective. The effect of this campaign on the movement was the opposite of what suppression is designed to achieve. The followers of Jesus who fled Jerusalem under persecution did not go quietly into retirement. They went to Samaria, to the Phoenician coast, to Antioch, and everywhere they went, they talked, not selectively, not cautiously. They spoke the message openly in the new communities where they arrived, communities that had no established social pressure against listening, no priestly aristocracy with institutional interest in the counter-narrative, no soldiers stationed at the local assembly. Antioch became the first major Gentile community of Jesus' followers. It became, eventually, the city from which the most aggressive missionary expansion of the first century was launched. It exists as a community precisely because the persecution in Jerusalem drove people there. The sociological pattern here is not unique to early Christianity. Suppression of ideas through force tends to function as advertisement. It signals that the suppressed idea is dangerous enough to be worth suppressing, which raises its perceived significance in the minds of those who encounter it. It also transforms the people being suppressed. Ordinary men and women suddenly become the protagonists of a story about truth being silenced, and that narrative carries its own extraordinary persuasive power. But there is something specific to this situation that goes beyond general sociology. The people being persecuted were not simply refusing to be silent about an idea. They were refusing to be silent about a personal encounter. Over and over again, in the accounts that survive, in Paul's letters, in Acts, in the fragments of early Christian writing outside the New Testament, the testimony is not primarily theological argument. It is personal witness. I saw him. We were there. He spoke to us. We touched him. We ate with him. Personal witness is the most resistant form of testimony to suppress, precisely because it cannot be refuted by argument. You can argue against a doctrine. You cannot easily argue someone out of what they claim to have personally experienced. And when the witnesses are willing to absorb severe consequences rather than retract that testimony, when they are flogged and say it again, imprisoned and say it again, threatened with death and say it again, the testimony acquires a weight that abstract argumentation simply cannot match. The authorities in Jerusalem understood this, which is why the conversations recorded in Acts between the Sanhedrin and the apostles have a particular quality of frustration. They cannot deny the healings being performed in Jesus' name. The text notes explicitly that the healing of the lame man at the temple gate was known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and they could not contradict it. They cannot produce a counter-explanation for the empty tomb that holds together under scrutiny. They cannot stop the witnesses from speaking without creating martyrs whose stories spread faster than living voices. They are trying to hold water with open hands, and they know it. There is one more figure in this story who has not yet been fully examined, and he is, in many ways, the most historically decisive of all. Saul of Tarsus did not become a follower of Jesus gradually. There was no slow persuasion, no accumulating weight of evidence considered over months, no moment of quiet intellectual capitulation. By his own account, and by the account preserved in Acts, the change was sudden, total, and occurred on a road outside Damascus, while he was actively engaged in the project of destroying the movement he would spend the rest of his life building. He had letters of authorization from the high priest in Jerusalem. He was traveling to Damascus to identify followers of Jesus in the synagogues there, arrest them, and bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. He was not a marginal figure having a private religious experience. He was an official agent of institutional suppression mid-mission when something happened that reversed the entire direction of his life. What makes the conversion of Paul historically extraordinary is not the drama of the event itself, but what it reveals about the nature of the evidence available to him. Paul was not ignorant of the resurrection claim. He knew it in detail. He had interrogated people who made it. He had overseen the execution of at least one of them, Stephen, whose stoning Paul explicitly acknowledges in his own letters. He had every access to the counter-narratives, every institutional resource for evaluating the claim, every personal motivation for finding it false. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of hostile, informed, institutionally connected witness whose testimony carries the most historical weight. Because he had everything to lose by changing his position, and nothing to gain except the consequences he immediately began experiencing. Those consequences were not abstract. Within days of arriving in Damascus as a transformed man, Paul was preaching in the synagogues that Jesus was the Son of God, with such force that the Jewish community there conspired to kill him. He had to be lowered over the city wall in a basket at night to escape. He returned to Jerusalem, where the followers of Jesus were initially terrified of him, a reasonable response given his recent history, and where the same authorities who had employed him now regarded him as a traitor. He spent the following decades traveling across the Mediterranean world, planting communities of Jesus followers in city after city, being beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, stoned, and left for dead, and finally, by all historical accounts, executed in Rome. He wrote, near the end of his life, that he had learned to be content in all circumstances, in abundance and in need, in freedom and in chains. That is not the language of a man who fabricated a story for social or material benefit. That is the language of a man who encountered something so real, so undeniable in his own experience, that no accumulation of suffering could make him question its foundation. And Paul understood, with the analytical precision of a trained Pharisaic scholar, exactly what was at stake in the claim he was making. In his first letter to the Corinthians, written approximately 20 years after the crucifixion, making it among the earliest documents in the New Testament, he presents the resurrection not as one doctrine among others, but as the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. If Christ has not been raised, he writes, then our proclamation is empty, and your faith is empty. He is not softening the claim. He is sharpening it to its most exposed and vulnerable point, and then standing behind it completely. He also does something in that same passage that historians find particularly significant. He lists witnesses, not in the general terms of many people saw him, but with specific categories. Peter, then the 12, then more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom, he notes, are still alive, implying they can be questioned. Then James, then all the apostles, and finally himself. This is the rhetorical structure of legal testimony, not devotional narrative. He is presenting a verifiable claim and gesturing explicitly toward the people who can verify it. This letter was circulating in the early communities within 2 decades of the events it describes. The witnesses Paul names were, many of them, still living. The communities reading the letter were connected enough to the Jerusalem community that false claims about living witnesses could be checked. This is not the environment in which fabricated testimony survives. What the historical record of the first century ultimately shows is not a story of a beautiful idea that spread because people wanted to believe it. It shows a story of a specific, concrete, verifiable claim. A man executed by Rome was seen alive 3 days later by multiple witnesses, that spread in direct proportion to the efforts made to stop it, carried by people who absorbed devastating personal consequences rather than retract it, transformed enemies into advocates, and moved through the information networks of the ancient world with a speed and reach that no human organizational effort of the time could have engineered. The Roman Empire eventually adopted Christianity as its official religion. The Sanhedrin that authorized the suppression of the first Jerusalem community ceased to exist after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The priestly aristocracy that paid soldiers to lie about a stolen body left no lasting institutional legacy. The movement they tried to silence produced the largest religious community in human history. None of that proves the resurrection. History cannot prove or disprove a singular event of that nature, and honest inquiry does not pretend otherwise. But history can ask whether the spread of the resurrection claim is better explained by the hypothesis that it was true or by the hypothesis that it was fabricated. And when you examine the actual texture of the first century world, the actual risks borne by actual people, the actual failure of sustained institutional suppression, the actual behavior of hostile witnesses who became advocates, the actual structure of the testimony preserved in documents written within living memory of the events, the fabrication hypothesis carries an extraordinary burden of its own, because it requires you to believe that a group of frightened, grieving, Socially vulnerable people in one of the most surveilled cities in the ancient world invented a story, maintained it perfectly under torture and threat of execution, convinced a hostile inquisitor sent to destroy them, and launched from that foundation a movement that reshaped the world. All without leaving behind a single defector who, in exchange for restored standing, safety, or simple relief from suffering, told the authorities what they so desperately needed to hear. That silence, the silence of the defector who never came forward, may be the most eloquent historical testimony of all. Jesus was not proclaimed in whispers from a safe distance. He was proclaimed in Jerusalem, in the temple courts, in the synagogues of Damascus and Antioch and Corinth and Rome, by people who knew exactly what it cost and paid it anyway. The truth they carried was not a comfort, it was a fire. And fire, as the ancient world well knew, does not spread by being hidden. It spreads by burning.